For the sake of time, we'll get started. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Let me see. Okay. Can you all see my screen or the presentation? Great. All right. Well, good morning to all. We hope everybody's doing well. Thank you all for joining us this morning for this session. And yeah, thank you to HR office for organizing and putting this virtual conference together during what has proven to be, an exceptionally unique time in our lives, and for inviting us to present today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Marco Fonseca. I am an assistant director in the Office of Intercultural Student Affairs, formerly known as Multicultural Student Development. I have been at Appalachian now 13 years. I am one of the lucky students who came here for undergrad and never got to leave. So I did all my undergrad here, my graduate work, and I've had the pleasure of working at Appalachian as a professional now for 8 years. And I'm here today because I feel like this is a very important topic in discussing, given everything that is going on in our communities and in our country as a whole. I think that these sessions have the potential to be the catalyst for us to really create some meaningful change within our institutions. So thank you all for being with us today, and I'll allow my co-presenter to introduce himself as well.
Hello, friends. My name is Matthew Thomas Reed, and I'm assistant professor in the College of Education and Leadership and Educational Studies. And when I do these kinds of things, I like to talk a little bit. Sorry, I got muted for a second. Talk a little bit about my why in terms of doing this work. I've had the opportunity over the last few years to have conversations with students who were willing to share some of their lack of safety, share experiences about how they felt marginalized and excluded from particular classroom spaces, and to hear stories about students who would stop going to class, who would take Fs in classes, literally because they felt so unsafe to be in a particular space. And I've also been fortunate enough to have students who are willing to talk to me about moments they felt unsafe in my class and to really think about some of my practices. So I definitely want to make sure that I'm very clear that I'm not a sage or know the right way to do it. I think Paulo Freire and Maxine Greene talk about this idea of being unfinished. I like to think of myself as always trying to do some of that work. I also think it's really fantastic to have folks go around and introduce themselves. Given the sheer number of people in here, we decided that probably wouldn't be tenable in 50 minutes. But we would like to invite any of you who want to share your why you're here in the chat box to do that, and that might give some of us an opportunity to look and see, make some connections about what's bringing us to this work. So I just wanted to open that invite to those of you, even though we're not going to really go around and do introductions for the sake of time.
All right, so as my colleague Matthew said, if you feel compelled to share why you're with us today in this session, please feel free to add it to the chat. We'll try to acknowledge as many points as we can from that chat box as we go through the session. So, all right, well, let's get started. So from the get-go, right? We want to make sure that you all feel comfortable in sharing. And again, please, anytime that we ask you to share, feel free to add anything in the chat box. So we want to start by asking you, right, when you're thinking about an inclusive environment, what comes to mind? And so again, feel free to add that in the chat box as we go. But these are some of the key elements that for us have been really important in sort of developing an inclusive environment. So an environment that respect to one another, right? So ensuring that we treat others in the ways that we would like to be treated. Championing identity affirmation. So making sure we understand each of us holds multiple salient identities. And as such, we are all exceptionally complex social beings, while also knowing that labels don't define us as individuals because of our complexities and the intersectionality of all those identities. An environment that is intentional about adding various cultural influences or ties to the space, meaning that we want to be deliberate about bringing and accounting for multiple views, opinions, perspectives, principles to the spaces that we form a part of and that we navigate. And then lastly, an environment that engages each individual to think beyond their own social and cultural norms. So really promoting and encouraging all of us to learn about different identifying or edifying standards, right? Going beyond our comfort zone, okay? So again, how does creating an inclusive environment relate to our strategic plan, right? From an institutional standpoint, okay? And so here we can take a look at the strategic plan that we had in place for the past 5 years. As you all may know, and as you can see by the dates, obviously we kind of reached the conclusion of that strategic plan, right? The Appalachian Experience, Envisioning a Just and Sustainable Future. But this is what provided direction for our campus over the past 5 years, right? And now we've entered a period of assessment and evaluation to see how well we did in meeting those marks, and now setting new goals for the next 5 years. It is I've come to find out that we should be getting a new strategic plan this fall. I know that COVID-19 sort of delayed that should have been released this past spring, but because of the unfortunate events of COVID, that has been pushed back. In addition to that, and thanks to Dr. Willie Fleming, our Chief Diversity Officer, we will also have a diversity strategic plan, specifically to diversity and inclusion matters, that will also roll out sometime this fall. And so, yeah, again, focusing on this past strategic plan, this served as the recognition that our primary focus was to transform the lives of the students and those who come here, right? Everybody comes here, particularly the students, come here for an experience, right? Provide an environment in which the students can grow holistically, in one that we can challenge them academically, one in which they embrace difference and diversity, to act with passion and determination, right? So we want to make sure that we focus on strategic direction number 4, which is embracing diversity of thought, belief, and community. And we want to do this by incorporating all of these into our administration, our policies, our practices, and our service, right? We want to create a culture that is really receptive to your beliefs, your identities, and your principles in order for all of us to engage in constructive dialogue. And so think of diversity as a crucial building agent, right, for the interdisciplinary approach to education, the blending of ideas and perspectives and opinions, right, that really leads to the creativity and innovation that helps us stay at the forefront of learning.
In thinking about deconstructing bias, I'm not going to read the bullets on here, but I really want to make this, I want to speak from a personal perspective. Peggy McIntosh, who's done a lot of writing about white privilege, talks about the importance of thinking through bias and privilege in a very personal way. And so for each of you, doing that work is going to be very personal. And for myself, recognizing the family that I grew up in, recognizing the influence of my father, who was an overt racist, recognizing the influence of a misogynist culture that I grew up in, is really critical in me understanding some of the biases that I continue to have. This isn't about me looking at any of you and saying, you are racist, you are homophobic, you are sexist. It's about me, it's about each of us looking within and saying, I know that I've experienced things in my life that have led me to have biases about others, that have led me to some really visceral reactions about others. And knowing that those exist are extremely important. And I think that that final bullet is really important to me. Be conscious of this visceral, almost bodily reaction or thoughts or judgments that you have about people who you see. I'll tell just a really short story. One of the first times I really recognized this was probably 10 years ago. I'm walking down the street downtown, and all of a sudden I find myself moving to the other side of the street. Just a visceral reaction. And I wasn't sure what was guiding that. And then I looked up and I saw that there was a black man who had been walking toward me. And my visceral reaction was to cross the other side of the street. To add insult to injury here, as I got closer, I recognized that I knew that man. He was a friend of mine. But my immediate visceral reaction was black male face, lack of safety. I'm telling you all this now because one might think, well, that he's confessing he's a racist. What I'm confessing to you is that I have very deep-seated biases that I'm continuing to try to deconstruct, that I know influences my thoughts and decisions, and I'm on a continuing process of doing that. When we think about deconstructing biases, we have to recognize that there is that which is on the surface and that which is deeper. And our reactions to, so you're accusing me of being a racist, I'm not a racist, or I'm not this because I don't have sort of overt I don't use the N-word, or I don't, I don't think women are inferior, or I don't do this, but there are these unconscious beliefs that lie below the surface that impact our actions, that actually make it possible for us to do and say things that are problematic, even if consciously we say, oh, I don't see color, or I treat everyone the same. These preferences bypass our normal, rational, logical thinking. These are things that, whether or not we think of this as innate, or if we think of this as learned, either way, it seems clear that we have neurological processes that make it more likely for us to have affinity with certain groups, make it more likely for us to prefer certain, I recognized at one point in my life that I was more likely to call on my male students than on my female students. This was something that I'm constantly reminding myself and thinking about in classroom spaces, my likelihood or propensity to do this thing.
Okay, so now that we've covered biases and deconstructing biases, we need to understand a couple of terms in order for us to move forward with the whole idea of creating more inclusive environments, right? So leveraging diversity and creating an inclusive community culture is a result of every single person at an institution being actively involved in that process. So to do that, right, we need to define and understand the following 4 terms. First one is diversity, inclusion, diversity management, and cultural intelligence. Okay, so let's get started with diversity, right? So when we think about diversity, we tend to think about racial diversity first, right? The color of somebody's skin or visible characteristics, the facial features, what somebody is wearing, and we start to make assumptions based on what we see in the biases that we have developed over time through our experiences or what others have shared with us about that particular interaction, right? So the concept of diversity is one that encompasses both acceptance and respect. It means understanding that each individual is unique and recognizing our individual differences, right? And this can be done in a number of different dimensions, right? Race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, our social economic status, our physical abilities, our age, our nationality, our religious beliefs, our political affiliations, and all these other ideologies, right? But what's important is that we embrace the exploration of all these differences, all these dimensions, in a very safe, positive, and nurturing environment. It's really about understanding each other and moving beyond simple tolerance to embracing and celebrating the rich dimensions of diversity contained within each of us, right? So this could be, when we think about it, right, we want to be more intentional in taking time to read a room, for example, right? Identifying our audience and engaging with them to identify their needs beyond what we can visibly see, okay? So going beyond the visible characteristics that we're able to identify.
And thinking through notions of inclusion, one of the ways that I like to play with this is through critiquing the golden rule. We tend to think, she'll do unto others as I would have them do unto me, and that's a very, it's kind of a selfish, really, way to consider the world, because if you think about it, that's me assuming that you want to be treated the way I want to be treated. And a number of conflicts come from that. And also, in terms of inclusion in particular spaces, that means that I don't have to think about historical and present day inequalities and societal issues in terms of how I treat you. I just treat you the way I want to be treated. Moving past that and recognizing that what has been humorously referred to as the platinum rule, do unto others as they would have you do unto them, requires you to have an understanding of them, their identity, their history, some of their needs, and better understanding, recognition, and efforts to be inclusive of non-visible identities is something that's also important. I think a lot about non-visible identities, both in relation to things like gender and sexuality, but also in relation to neuroatypicalities. A person might otherwise seem from a set of normative identities, but you don't know what might actually be at play that changes what this person brings to the table in relation to anything from class to gender to sexuality to neurotypicality.
So then when we start to think about diversity management, okay, this is the definition that Roosevelt Thomas, one of the originators of sort of diversity and inclusion within the work environment, defined, right? The process of creating and maintaining an environment that naturally enables all participants to contribute to their full potential in focused pursuit of organizational objectives, right? This is an important aspect given the diversity that exists on our campus and in our communities. Everyone has to believe they belong in this environment, that they are a good fit at the institution, and that they know precisely how they contribute to the success of their organization or office, right? And it includes the improvement of relationships among people who are different, who come from different backgrounds, right? Or who have had different experiences. So people need to feel comfortable taking risks, right? Allowing ourselves to be vulnerable by being our authentic selves, right? Living through our values and our principles is a risk we have to take if we want to experience meaningful connections, right? That sharing of ideas and cultural norms is really important for the development of an office culture. And so we need to feel invested in our own success and in that of the community so that we become more cooperative and innovative in how to move forward. So for example, if someone is used to being othered, right? Meaning they don't fit in with the majority, it's difficult to fully be themselves in that space. And so what ends up happening is folks come into that space and they realize that they're not accepted being who they truly are. And so they find ways to assimilate and effectively make their person, which involves code switching, right? Meaning that we change the way we talk to each other, or that I talk to somebody else based on who they are, or the way that I interact with them based on who they are. And so what you ultimately get is somebody who's trying to just fit in and put on a suit and put on a facade, right? The value of diversity management is that someone is being able, someone has the opportunity to come into a space and do things in a way that suits them, that they dress the way they want to dress, to talk the way they want to talk, to interact with people the way that they want to interact with people, and still be able to perform at a high level and produce and add value to the work environment in a respectful way, right? So if I can do, you know, if we can do that and people see that, the person who comes in next can have a similar experience, and then they have an easier path, and it becomes a wider space for all.
I'd like to return to the idea of the golden rule for a moment and think about this idea of how we assume we ought to treat others, and thinking through some of the both surface level cultural differences and deeper level cultural differences that impact the way that individuals make meaning in the world. I was, when really simple example, I was raised with the mantra, "Look at me when I'm talking to you, boy." And that was from my father, and it meant that I was to make eye contact with him. He deemed it rude otherwise. There are cultural traditions in which to look at the person in authority in the eye is considered rude. The exact opposite. And so, you know, with that in mind, I think recognizing knowledge of not just making yourself a repository of how multiple cultures might interact with each other, but recognizing that conflict sometimes occurs because individuals make meaning in different ways. The idea of what is rude is different from culture to culture. It's different in some cases from region to region. And being mindful and developing some of these cultural competencies, and there's a little graphic in relation to that. You know, it's in particular, I think about right now and the ways in which we greet each other, and this has been really challenged, you know, during these viral times, where I've been on both sides of this, you know, where I go to shake someone's hand because it's so visceral, it's so ingrained in me, and then someone will back off like this, and then I'm also reminding myself, and I'll be in a situation where someone will go to hug me or shake my hand, and I'll just kind of back up like this. We have to recognize that some of our traditional ideas about ascribing meaning to an action really have to change. So when I lean forward to shake a hand and you do like this, that doesn't mean you're being rude. That doesn't mean you don't like me. That doesn't mean that you're trying to create conflict. There are different meanings to the way that works. And so again, the graphic just sort of shows some of these, you know, some of these surface level pieces, but actually can become a lot deeper when we interpret their meaning as rude, as opposed to recognizing these are different ways to interact in the world.
Yeah, and I would add to what Matthew just shared. You know, I was born and raised in Honduras, and it was traditional for us to always greet, you know, our elders with a kiss, right, on the cheek if they were a woman, like kissing my grandmother or my aunts, and then always shaking my uncle or you know, my cousin's hand and giving them a hug. And I recall when I was very young, when I had just arrived in the United States, I was about 12 years old. I got invited for the first time to a friend's house from school. You know, they had just invited me, and I thought, this is really cool. You know, I'm making new friends. And when he first introduced me to his mom, I went up to her and said hello and shook her hand and leaned in for a kiss on the cheek. And she shook my hand and immediately pulled back. And I, you know, I was a kid, a 12-year-old, and I was like, oh my gosh, I did something wrong. But it's not necessarily I had done anything wrong. I simply wasn't aware of the cultural norm that exists here, right? Where that was something that was that I would do unconsciously because I had done it my entire life, throughout with my family or with the people that I grew up with. That is not necessarily acceptable or done in this culture. And so that's one of those things that, again, I was 12 years old and I just didn't know how to react. It was an awkward and an interesting sort of interaction, but it's still very vivid in my mind because that's not what I was used to. That's not how I grew up. And so it's something that kind of has become a bit more relevant given everything that we're experiencing with COVID-19 now, where we have those interesting social interactions where sometimes you don't know if you're going to shake somebody's hand or if you're just going to do a little fist bump or, however you greet each other nowadays. So I just thought I'd add an anecdote to what Matthew was saying. So, all right. So now we've arrived at the activities. So we are going to show you a series of images and we will give you, I don't know, Matthew, what do you think? 15, 20 seconds per image, at least for this first one?
Sure.
And we would like for you to write on the chat, what do you immediately see? Okay, so again, we're going to show you a couple of images. And once you put in the chat, what is the first thing that you see in that image? Okay, so here is the first one. And again, your first initial reaction. So take about 10 seconds to look at it and then write it in the chat box.
And it looks almost 50-50.
Yep, that's what I'm noticing too. Some of you have been able to see both. Okay, here's the next one. This one's a little bit trickier. Again, write the first thing that you see on that chat box. Okay, we'll do one more.
It is fascinating how it's literally almost half and half.
And now this. So I think it's really interesting, just like Matthew was saying, that half and half see one thing, the other half sees another, right? And what we're trying to get at is that our perception is context driven, right? And it directly plays into our biases, whether it's conscious or unconscious, right? So we make assumptions based on what we see, but if we don't understand what we're actually looking at, right, we may be misguided in what we're actually assuming. And so it's really important to have that context, right? So I can give you an example, right? So if you were to see a person who may look like they are Latino or Latinx descent, right, in traditional attire or garments that may be considered ceremonial to the native culture, and assuming that they have direct cultural ties by their physical presentation, right, their skin color, their ethnicity, and again, their traditional clothing, This is a great example because that person may be assumed as Latino, could in fact be born in the United States, in America, with no cultural ties to their community that one would assume they are to be. So in theory, this is an example of how context directly affects our perception, which subsequently drives our conscious and unconscious biases. Okay, so remember, context is really important in understanding in our perceptions, right, and the assumptions that we make.
So I actually want to start with one of the comments that I just noticed. It said your brain fills in info from the clues that you immediately see. Ginger Bryant wrote that, and I think that's a really important point. And it's the way in which we fill in meaning without us really even thinking about it. And the ways in which that meaning can be manipulated is really, really critical. So we're going to up the stakes just a tiny bit. And I want to ask, in this first set of images, some of what you see, and just first impressions. So go ahead and show the first set of images. I'm seeing things like student athlete, happy, youthful. A few folks have recognized that this isn't all in fact, this is in fact Trayvon Martin. Beautiful boy, young child. Okay, so think about some of what you see in these images that make you think that. You've got student athlete, you might have student scholar, you see well-dressed, you see the future, with maybe the cake with the university on it, growth and innocence I see written here. So these are some really important things that these images cultivate. So now let's look at the next set of images. I'm not going to ask you to type what you see in here, and I'm doing that intentionally. I'm making an intentional choice. I just want you to reflect, okay? I want you to reflect on some of the differences. These are also, with the exception of one picture, images of Trayvon Martin. The first set of images or images that were propagated by left-leaning media. The second set of images were propagated by right-leaning media. Now, I'm not specifically making a partisan political point here, because my argument is that both sets of images are manipulating your perception and understanding of this young person. Whether we want to portray him as a youthful, innocent, happy young boy, or we want to portray him as, and we could think of a number of things here, someone who is somewhat more menacing. Looking in particular at the hoodie picture, which is in both, the picture that has been made close up and darkened to appear somewhat more ominous. The image of him shirtless in the bottom right corner, by the way, isn't him. It was propagated as him, but not him. The image of him flipping the bird is really interesting for me, because I've used this in my classroom, and I've had students talk about how, how disrespectful that is, and how it shows him as someone who does not like authority and who is potentially dangerous. And then I asked them the question, how many of you have that poster of Johnny Cash flipping off the camera? And it's very, very different in one's mind. Oh, Johnny Cash was a rebel. He was cool. He didn't follow any rules. And yet, when you see this gesture on a young black man, an underage child, yet we create this notion of menace. So as we think about I like to take a semiotics approach, the signs and the signifiers, the meanings that we make. Some of our biases are that we put meaning on different bodies in different ways. And for any woman in the room that has ever been told she had RBF, I'm not going to say it out loud, but most of you know what it is. For any woman who's ever been told that, you know you're holding your face in the same way that a man would hold his face and not be told that. I am 40 years old and I have never once in my entire life been told that I had RBF, and I probably never will. We do judge and see different bodies differently in terms of how they do the same act. And that's really some of what I wanted to get out of this slide.
Okay, so now that we've had those activities, we wanted to bring to the forefront some of the initiatives that we are noticing at Appalachian State University. So I won't go through every single one of them, but I'll touch on some of them. So the first one is the food pantry in the free store. I think most of you are aware that food insecurity is a real thing still plaguing our communities, our students, and even our colleagues. To my knowledge, now we have 4 different food pantries located on campus, the main one being on East Hall, in the basement of East Hall. There's other ones in the College of Education, in Dede Daugherty, and in Edwin Duncan. But this is a really good resource, not only for students, but for us as well, for anybody who is experiencing food insecurity in our community. Housing accommodations, another one that's a pretty big one, particularly in housing, obviously. So this is specifically more directed to students who are transgender or who identify as non-binary, who want to have the opportunity to live with people who are like them or who have very similar identities. And so very important that we are accommodating to their needs. And so this is something that you can find through the housing website or through the ISA website. Single occupancy restrooms. I think this is something that we're all well aware of. This is something that came up, I think, in 2014 with HB2, right? So having issues, having individuals using restrooms that didn't match their identity, perhaps, or an identity that we saw as visible. And so this is something that will start changing. I believe that the Student Recreation Center, UREC, will be the first and start implementing and changing the signage of all these restrooms where it will be single use so that people feel a bit more willing and able to use the restroom that feels they identify with, or just not having to even think about that, particularly when it comes to single occupancy restrooms. Sustained dialogue, it's a really good program or initiative that we have on our campus to have discussions on serious topics, like COVID-19, immigration, healthcare reform, things of that sort. Preferred first name for students, something that has been discussed through our administration, right? Having the ability to go by the name that we want to go by. Sometimes that doesn't match our legal name. What's on our birth certificate or what's on our driver's license, sorry. So that's something that has been explored and it's being explored still, to my knowledge, about being able to add that perhaps to our app cards so that people feel more comfortable in identifying with the name that they actually want to be referred to. And then here on the right, we've got the Inclusive Excellence team. Matthew, would you like to say anything about that in particular?
So the Inclusive Excellence team is sort of a slightly grassroots organization of liaisons from every department throughout the college. And one of the things that we're trying to do are provide training and resources for individuals who who do want to continue doing the work of diversity and inclusion in classrooms and in different spaces throughout the university, including, but not limited to, things like trainings in relation to pronouns, identity, names, but also we're doing some inclusive syllabus trainings for folks who want to explore that a little bit more. So if you're not familiar or you don't know who your Inclusive Excellence Liaison is, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to get you in contact with someone who can give you some more resources within your individual department.
We also have, most of you may know that we have faculty and staff affinity groups. We've got the Black Faculty Staff Association. We've got APUNIDOS, which is the Latinx or Hispanic Faculty Staff Association. We've got a Native American Association. To my knowledge, we also have an LGBT faculty staff organization on campus. So those are all different resources and communities that exist for us as professionals. Most of you may be aware of Appalachian Allies training. This is a safe zone training on how to be a better ally to the LGBT community, not just our students, but also our colleagues within this community. So this is something that is coming out of the ISA office, but in collaboration with Summer Wisdom and Rebecca Murray as the leaders of that training at the moment. Something new that I'd like to mention to everybody is the immigrant allyship training. So I think we're all well aware that the media really brings a lot of notoriety to students who are DACA students, or what would you say, what's the other term? Undocumented students. And the reality is that there's a lot more statuses that affect our students and our colleagues than just those two. And so we want to create something similar to Appalachian Allies, where we are able to provide knowledge and educational resources that really provide information on all those different statuses and how to be a good ally and a better ally to those individuals. I myself was a holder of TPS, which I'm sure hardly anybody knows, but that stands for Temporary Protective Status. And I lived with that status in the United States for 20 years, which to me hardly stands as temporary. So something that I really want to bring some attention to, because that has been my life for 20 years. And I think it's really important to educate ourselves on all those different immigration statuses that exist within the United States. And Matthew, I'll let you kind of take on the last three.
Well, so Able Action and GAP are two organizations that are both faculty and student driven. Able Action is kind of casting a critical lens on some of the ableist, practices and cultures and ethos in the university. GAP is called Gay and Progressive Pedagogy. It's in the College of Education, and our slogan is sort of activism through education. So there are a lot of resources that we're doing there, in particular to work with our queer identified, trans, non-binary student population in the College of Ed. I mentioned early intervention team just briefly because I think a lot of folks think of this as, oh, I have a student who is in trouble academically, I'll call on the early intervention team. The early intervention team also exists to help advocate for students, to help provide them with resources. These are sometimes folks who might have, invisible disabilities. These are folks who might be going through some particular, personal trauma. So I just wanted to plug the early intervention team for that reason.
Great. So some additional resources that we want to share with you, and most of you may already know these, are knowing who our CDO is, our Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Willie Fleming. He sort of oversees the institutional implementation of diversity and inclusion initiatives. We have the Summer Inclusion Infusion conference that I think unfortunately we were not able to hold this summer because of COVID-19. But again, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, he is coming out with a diversity strategic plan specifically this fall. So that's something to look forward to. Lamont Sellers, who is the new director of the Office of Intercultural Student Affairs. That's the office I work in. He comes to us from the University of South Dakota, where he was formerly a CDO there, a Chief Diversity Officer. And our office really focuses on programming and being the boots on the ground for our students and being able to provide them resources, advocacy, guidance, and all these different types of services that our students need. And then lastly, we have Jamie Anderson and Greg McClure, who are going to serve as interim directors of Inclusive Excellence while Dr. Brandy Bryson is on sabbatical this coming year. And this sort of focuses more on the diversity and inclusion that exists within the curriculum, right? So in the classroom, how can we ensure that our classroom is really exploring multiple pedagogy and points of learning, right? So multiple ways of engaging our students and learning in different environments. So again, these are 3 people that we should really know about as good resources for diversity and inclusion initiatives on our campus. And on the right-hand side, you guys see a bunch of different offices that are also very important to know about. I won't go through all of them, but these are some of the places that we can also go to in case we do have questions that pertain to diversity or inclusion related matters.
We come to that time in the presentation for that one slide that has way too much content on it for the time we have left. So forgive me for this. But I really wanted to address, at least briefly, some of the barriers to doing this work. My guess is that most of us are here today because we care and we want to do it. But when we're working with some of our faculty, some of our colleagues, here are some of the barriers. So if you just want to, I'll go through these briefly. Rugged individualism. Oh, I don't see categories. I just judge the person. It's about the individual, not the group. Objectivity. There's a right way to do this. That's just your opinion. Cops are good. It's just your opinion that some of them are X. Those kinds of things. Fear of open conflict. I don't want to offend people. I just want to keep the peace. And for anyone else who is a Southerner, I will say this on behalf of my people who I love: we do not like to fight. We do not like conflict. We like to avoid it at all costs. We also believe in the right to comfort often. I think that's very Southern. Why do you have to be rude? Why do you always have to bring up race? Why do you always have to talk about this? Let's just keep things comfortable. Paternalism. Let me fix that for you. You just don't understand. Oh, well, it's more complicated than you realize. Well, there's so many moving parts to this. Defensiveness. I'm not racist. I have gay friends. You're always pulling the woman card, whatever. And this next one, which I know we've lived through this on this campus, hiding behind academic freedom, the right to say X. And so just briefly, I'll talk about moving past the barrier, recognizing instead of thinking about rugged individualism, think about systemic oppression. What's beyond the individual situation needs addressing. Past objectivity is multiple epistemologies. What might they understand from their perspective that I don't? Instead of fear of open conflict, learning through the conflict. How might I find ways to teach and learn in conflict instead of avoiding it? These are skills that are useful, that matter. Right to comfort instead of the right to comfort, recognizing that comfort is not safety. We can sometimes make folks from normative groups feel uncomfortable. White folks hate to talk about race, Straight folks often are getting uncomfortable talking about, non-straight topics. But that's distinctly different from the lack of safety that many marginal groups can feel in certain spaces. Instead of paternalism, recognizing mutuality. Maybe I can't fix the situation because I don't know enough. How can I learn from and support you? And instead of defensiveness, critical reflectiveness. What hurtful thing did I do or say that hurt them? Okay, they're calling me a racist. What did I do? Let me look at my actions and divorce myself from that action for a second and say, okay, maybe I did do or say something. Let's be critical about this rather than go straight to defensiveness. And recognizing that words can produce a lack of safety. Just because I can say a word doesn't mean it won't damage our community. What are the implications of my actions?
So that kind of brings us to the end of our presentation. And we wanted to end with this graphic or this image that we were able to find, or that I was able to find in social media. And I think it's a great way for you to really kind of bring all of this that we just discussed for the past 50 minutes together. And I'll go ahead and read it for everybody. So when we're thinking about diversity and inclusion, right, these are things that we should be thinking about consistently. So diversity asks, who is in the room? Equity responds, who is trying to get in the room but can't? Whose presence in the room is under constant threat of erasure? Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? And justice responds, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority? Diversity then asks, how many more of, pick any minoritized identity, group do we have this year than last? Equity responds, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as the perpetual majority here? Inclusion then asks, is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? And then justice challenges, whose safety is being sacrificed and minimized to allow others to be comfortable maintaining dehumanizing views? So this is a great way to wrap up everything that Matthew and I have covered in this presentation. As we go through this, or as you go through your day-to-day, I ask you to reflect on the times that you have felt included in a group, but to also reflect on the times that you were excluded from a group and how you felt by that. Remember what you have learned here today, and how can you apply that in your day-to-day interactions with colleagues and with students at Appalachian? Remember that diversity is a fact and inclusion is a choice. Diversity is not merely a means to an end or a way to enrich the experience of the majority. It is the recognition of the collective mixture of differences, similarities, and complexities in each other. And inclusion is a lifestyle, a way of living, a conscious decision we all have the capability of making to create a more welcoming and accepting environment, right? So in order for us to practice inclusion, there must be diversity of some sort within our environment, okay? If we're truly serious about creating safe and inclusive environments for everyone, right? Everyone from our leadership to our students need to be intentional and purposeful about creating a wider space for all to habitate. So with that, I know that we are probably out of time, but we are here for maybe 2 or 3 more minutes if anybody has any questions.
I wanted to address Jessica Guggenheimer's comment. Can we have a copy of these slides? Marco and Kevin, I guess we can make this, maybe find a way to make this available for everyone.
Yes, my understanding is that this is being recorded, and it will be available to everybody to revisit at some point. You know, I'll let Kevin or Emily maybe interject, or if I said something that was incorrect, please let me know.
So it is being recorded right now, and Marco, Matthew, and Emily, we can communicate about getting the slides out in the best way possible.
Great. Well, yeah, like I said, if anybody has questions, please feel free to put them on the chat box, or you can email us directly. Here are our emails in case you want to engage in maybe some private dialogue. But yeah, thank you all again for choosing to spend 1 hour today with us and learning more about creating safe and inclusive environments on our campus.